We're talking today with Dr. James Harris of Worthington, Minnesota, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, can you start us off with a little bit of background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Born in Mobridge, South Dakota, December 29th, 1941.
All right, now did you grow up in that area or did you move around?
When I was 8 years old, my parents moved to Minneapolis. I graduated from Richfield High School in the Minneapolis suburbs in 1969.
Okay, now what did your family do for a living?
My father's a physician.
Okay, all right, and did you kind of grow up expecting that you would become a doctor yourself?
Oh yeah, yeah.
All right, and so then what did you do when you finished high school?
Well, I went to Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, and I majored in chemistry. I was also one of the captains on the wrestling team.
All right. And as you're growing up and things like that, had you any thoughts about going into the service or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I did some, but you know, if you're going to have a family in the service, I think it was just sounded too disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I wouldn't have minded being in the service, but I think it would have been hard on the families.
All right. So when did you graduate then from Carleton?
1963 in June.
Okay. And then where did you go from there?
Well, I worked a year, and I went in the fall of '64. I started the University of Minnesota Medical Center, University of Minnesota Medical School,
Okay.
and I graduated from there in June of 1968.
Okay. So you're in medical school 64 to 68.
Yeah.
And what was going on there in terms of people, medical school versus going to the military? Was the military taking a lot of doctors at that point?
Well, they weren't taking anybody out of medical school,
Okay.
but they were drafting everybody after a year of internship. And we all knew that at the end of our first year after medical school, we were doing, and in those days it was called an internship,
Mm-hmm.
not postgraduate year one like it is now.
Right.
And there was a little more moving around after postgraduate year one in those days. People expected to intern in one place and maybe not necessarily do their specialty training in the same location. And that's what I did. I did my internal medicine internship at the University of Missouri Medical Center. And I'd already interviewed for Hennepin County Medical Center surgery training in Minneapolis before I finished that year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I ended up taking my surgery training.
All right. And were you, okay, so you have, so the force, okay, so I guess the way it works now, the modern system, you're in medical school for 3 years and then,
4.
okay, you do 4.
Yeah.
Okay, but this was, I'm just trying to figure out the chronology
Well,
of
this
it.
was 4 years of medical school.
Right.
A year of internship.
Right.
I finished my internship on basically June 30th, 1969.
Mm-hmm.
Got a job working as a place in the hospital because I didn't have orders to report until the 15th of October.
Okay, but you had orders to, so you had effectively
I
been
didn't get
drafted.
those orders. I knew I had already taken my physical before we were finished.
Mm-hmm.
And the first set of orders said the 1st of August.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was if you didn't sign up to be an officer. I didn't realize that till later. But after you took the oath to be an officer, then you got another set of orders that said come in on the 15th of December. If I wouldn't have signed that, I would have got orders to report to Fort Leonard Wood for basic training.
Okay.
E1.
Ooh.
You know, I was in good enough shape. I wasn't, to go through that without any trouble at all. But it's always better if you're in the officer corps, I guess.
Right. Well, I mean, basically, does someone explain to you this is how it works, or
No, I found that out later.
All right.
They got a nasty letter from them. You have to take this oath or else.
Okay.
So I came down and took the oath.
All right. So I guess the assumption was that you were going to take the oath. If they were doing this, they wanted you as a doctor,
Oh, yeah.
and they were going to bring you, and they didn't want you to go through the
No.
rest of it.
Well, I
Okay.
wouldn't mind going to basic training and go to Fort Sam later anyway.
All right. So what kind of training then do you get?
In the middle, in the Fort Sam.
Okay, you got Fort Sam Houston,
Yeah,
out of Texas.
and I think we probably had 12, 18 hours of hiking in the field, shooting weapons, all that kind of stuff. And a couple more hours of classroom instruction, and all the rest of it was, this is the way the Army's organized, this is how the hospitals are organized, and all that kind of stuff. We didn't spend a lot of time.
Did they spend much time on sort of the discipline type stuff that they did with the regular recruits? Oh, the spit polish kind of thing? Or?
Oh yeah, probably about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Not much.
So they didn't really expect doctors to be like everybody else?
I think, no, they didn't, and I think their expectations were pretty generally pretty accurate.
Right. Okay, so how long do they keep you down there?
6 weeks.
Okay, so it's a 6-week course?
Yeah.
All right. And then the guys training alongside you, are they all pretty much in your situation?
Everybody in that group that I know of had orders to report to Vietnam before they got done.
Yeah. And
Before
they're,
we got done with the 6 weeks.
right.
We all assumed we'd be going there. There might have been a few that didn't, but I didn't know. I don't know who they were.
But I meant in terms of just in the sense that you had done your 1 year, your first year of internship and were coming in.
Some of those guys had, well, we were all going into the Army for the first time.
Right.
And some of those guys had had a year on the Barry Plan, a year of surgery, a year of this, and some of them had completed training programs. But, you know, they all had the basic, this is your, if you're a doctor, this is your introduction to what we think you need to know to get into the Army.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what that was all about. Most of them had a lot of guys had more than a year after medical school.
Okay. All right. So, and about how many of them were in the class together?
Oh, a couple hundred.
Okay.
Big clue.
So there's a whole bunch of people and they're just herding you through this process?
Pretty much, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
You get to the end of that and then what happens?
Well, we had orders to report to Vietnam, and we all had a few days off, like a week's leave or something. And
Now, were you married at this time?
No.
Okay.
you know, I went and drove my car down, parked it in my grandpa's barn, and flew out to San Diego and visited my brother, who just was in Navy boot camp for a day, and then up to San Francisco. And the plan was to take a bus from San Francisco Airport to Travis Air Force Base, and then we'd get our transportation assignments.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we got to San Francisco, and I went up and mailed a package off and found out they sold 80 tickets to a 58-seat bus. And they gave the last ticket on the plane I was supposed to be on to go to Vietnam away to the guy in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really scared, which didn't know any better, shouldn't have been. And we got into Long Binh in the middle of the night
Okay. But now did
in
you,
Vietnam, yeah.
but did you go over to Oakland and take the next, or Travis to take a later flight out? Or?
Well, actually, the plane I was going to be on, the next plane I was going to be on was in San Francisco.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And they had electrical problems, and when they had that fixed, it was fogged in at Travis, so they couldn't land, so they just busted all the guys on that, supposed to be on that plane into the airport in San Francisco, and we were supposed to leave at 8 o'clock in the morning. Somebody forgot to tell the pilot, and by the time he got there, it was about 9:30, I think, when we took off.
Okay, so you got to know the San Francisco airport pretty well?
Well, sure.
All right. Okay, so they fly you over. Now, and what route did they take? Do you remember that? To get to
Landed in Hawaii. My cousin was a psychiatrist in the Navy at the time, and I called him on the phone. He asked me up to dinner, and I told him I was really, I'd really like to go there, but I had a plane to catch.
Mm-hmm.
And they refueled again in Wake Island, and then we landed at Tonson Nut, actually, not Long Binh.
Okay. And what was now did they land you at Tonson Nut? Was that during the day or at night?
In the middle of the night.
Okay. And was there anything going on when you landed?
No.
Okay, so just quiet?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, they loaded us all on buses, and there were 3 or 4 buses. They had a Jeep with a machine gun in front of the first bus and another one behind the last bus. And we drove over to Long Binh,
Mm-hmm.
and the only thing we saw was 3 women getting unloaded from the back of a small truck into. And we get to Long Binh, and we filled out pay records, where do we want the money to go that we were sending home and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went, somebody gave me a ride over to the 44th Med Brigade, which is where my assignment was originated from.
Mm-hmm.
And my assignment was the 2nd Mobile Army Surgical Hospital in Lai Khe. And within an hour of the time we got there, the Lai Khe people had a truck down for supplies, and somebody hooked us up with that, so I rode back up on that truck.
All right. And then is it daylight when you're doing that?
That was during the day.
Okay. So what's your first impression of Vietnam?
Well, I'd heard a lot of stories about the stuff around Saigon being pretty quiet, so the sort of hurry up and wait,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't a whole lot different than I expected. You get into the military, and you have to be there to realize what the military is like. I think you can. It's a different lifestyle, and you know, Fort Sam really wasn't very good for getting used to that. You know, and it takes a while for it all to sink in. You know, they really, you know, it could easily be on a different planet, almost. But you know, you get used to it, and that was the main impression. This is how we do stuff here.
So it was less about Vietnam in some physical sense. I mean, a lot of guys talk about getting there and being struck by the heat or the smell or that kind of thing. But for you, it's almost more the realization that you're really in the military?
Yeah, well, not so much that you're in the military. I knew that, but it's the military. This is a different place.
Yeah.
You know, and it's, you know, you can't explain to people what it's like. You have to be there. I mean, I don't have the communication skills it takes to tell people, you know, this is what you do when you're in the Army, and this is how your thought process works. You know, you can talk to these guys down there, and you know these guys understand it because they've been there. But none of the wives do. You know, and none of the relatives do. I mean, you know,
and of course, it means doing the stuff that I'm doing. It's always like this Sisyphean task. You're never going to get all the way there, and you know it when you start.
Well, it's, you know, I had some interesting experiences in the military, and two of them were people that I talked to, and one had been a medic at Pearl Harbor. And I asked him what that's like, and he just got a long look on his face, and he said it was just awful. And that was all I could get out of him, you know, and I guess what he's telling me is they didn't have the communication skills to tell him what it was just like. And there was another guy in my unit, the 101st Airborne Division, that had jumped into Normandy and liberated one of the German concentration camps. And I asked him what it was like, and he had exactly the same look on his face. And he said it was just awful. It's the same word. And I think, you know, this guy was a private when he was there. You know, I don't know how much education he had. And that was just his way of saying, you know, I don't have the communication skills it takes to be able to tell anybody what that was really like. And you just had to be there.
All right. But we'll try anyway.
Yeah.
All right. Do you remember anything about the trip up to Lai Khe?
No. You know, we were up and down a couple of times, and there was nothing special. Later on, when I went from Lai Khe to Phu Loi is about halfway between the two. And we had a 3/4-ton truck, one of those little Dodge trucks. And by then I had acquired a 12-gauge shotgun. And, you know, the people in that truck said, if they get too close, you wave that shotgun around. Just let them know you're going to let it get a little too close, you know. So, if you guys, you know, you never, you know, the Vietnamese people were probably a little more trustworthy than we give credit for. On the other hand, they were under a lot of pressure, and sometimes we were telling them the bad stuff they didn't want to. And we had the shotgun around a little bit, and they'd back off a little bit.
All right. You get up to Lai Khe, and then what kind of reception do you get up there?
Well, hi. It was, you know, they check in and they showed you a bunk and stuff like that. And we were in hooches, which were basically a big tent with, instead of tent poles on the walls, they had 2x4s and screen mail between them, so you could roll up the side of the tent and get all the bugs flying in on you. And the canvas on the top was just the roof to keep the rain off. And we were all doctors, so they gave us a little more space. We had 4 in a tent. And we had enough room, and it was, you know, it was nothing special, but it wasn't awful or horrible or anything. We didn't have ever living in a bunker.
All right. Now, was this, at times that had been a divisional base camp for different units?
It was the 1st Infantry was there when we were there, and that was one of their main base camps.
All right.
And we were off to one side. If we didn't really see very much of those guys a lot. They were out in the field a lot. And when we were there, the 1st Infantry was in the process of being withdrawn.
Right.
And once the 1st Infantry got out to a pretty low level, then they closed the hospital. And that was the reason we went to Lai Khe.
All right.
To Phu Loi.
Okay. Now, while you're there, I mean, and so how quickly do they put you to work?
Oh, I don't know. Well, certainly within 24 hours.
All right.
You know, I don't remember if I had to do anything the first night or not, but after that we did.
All right. And how much activity was there? What kind of business did you have?
It had slowed down a little bit, but we still took care of a lot of Vietnamese Army casualties and a lot of civilians. And we sort of had 2 groups of casualties, actually. The GIs would come in mostly in the evening. and the civilians would come in at 8 o'clock in the morning. The North Vietnamese or VC would booby trap the road from town to where they were working their farm plots, sometimes even the gate to the place. So we always got civilians in at 8 o'clock in the morning. And they were being targeted specifically. It was, these weren't friendly fire incidents or anything else. These guys were targets. And I'd been told a lot of things that led me to believe that a lot of the civilian casualties were due to the Vietnamese army and the Americans and stuff like that. I remember in particular one time I asked one of the Vietnamese civilians if the Vietnamese army did that to him, and she had this completely incredulous look on her face. And the interpreter said, no, it was the VC. So, most of the, we had very few casualties that were on civilians that were inflicted by either the Vietnamese army or the American army. Some were friendly fire incidents. And we had some of our own guys in those too, but most of the casualties we had on the civilians were inflicted purposefully by the VC and the North Vietnamese.
So they're almost targeting the civilians because they're more vulnerable and less dangerous than the Americans are?
I think they were targeting the civilians to intimidate them into helping them out. And anybody, that was a friendly Hamlin, and some were more friendly than others, they knew they were going to get some grief.
Okay. Describe a little bit the MASH unit itself in terms of how big it was, or how many people were there, and that kind of thing.
We had 3 operating rooms and about 15 or 20 doctors. And a couple of wards with maybe 15 or 20 beds in each one. And we did mostly stabilization. Somebody had to be operated on. We'd do that. And they did a pretty good job of spreading the casualties around. We got casualties from a lot of places because the hospitals in Long Binh had like an 8-hour wait in the operating room, and we didn't have any. And but we had an emergency room right off the helipad, and we had 6 stretchers in there, and sometimes we had all 6 filled up. And they'd go. The blood bank was out the back door. It was about as far as the room across the hall. And if you need to give those guys blood, and a lot of them had lost limbs and major amputations, which is the majority of patients we saw had traumatic amputations in their lower limbs. And give them a couple of units of blood, take them to the operating room, and clean them up and stop the bleeding. And then the next day, they're usually stable enough to transfer.
And so if they're Vietnamese, are you sending them to Vietnamese hospitals at that point?
Pretty much.
All right. And what kind? Did you know anything about the medical facilities available for the Vietnamese otherwise?
Well, the only stuff you heard was they weren't very good. We also took care of some North Vietnamese prisoners, or VC or whoever, and the word that we had was that they weren't particularly, their needs weren't very well met in the civilian, in the South Vietnamese hospitals. But, they were pretty crowded, and they probably had a lot of their own people they didn't have room for either.
All right. And when you had the North Vietnamese or VC prisoners, how did you handle them or deal with them?
Well, I think, you dealt with them medically the same as you did with everybody else. I mean,
Were there guards on them or that kind of thing?
Interestingly enough, you have to have MPs with those guys. And we had the Surgeon General from Vietnam going through our place one day, and he asked somebody what the MP was doing next to the North Vietnamese prisoner. He says, yeah, make sure he doesn't escape. Well, that was wrong. The MPs are there to protect the prisoners from the other patients. And that is said in the Geneva Convention. Nobody realized that at the time. But there were stories of American GIs in places waking up from an anesthetic and finding out the guy next to him was somebody that they, the enemy, they had reached over and beat him. So the MP was that requirement is stated in the Geneva Conventions.
All right. Now, what kind of staff did you have beyond the 15 or so doctors?
Oh, we had a couple of X-ray technicians, a couple of lab people. We had 3 people that did anesthesia. A bunch of people did, scrub techs and stuff like that. It was for the number of operating rooms we had and the number of surgeons we had, it was actually a pretty decent staff.
All right. Did you have a nursing staff?
Oh yeah, and Some of those people were nurses, and they had nurses on the ward. They had, I think the place actually probably was adequately staffed.
Okay. Do you have male or female nurses or both?
Both.
Okay.
Both.
All right.
I think mostly females, actually.
All right. Yeah, and how did the women seem to kind of deal with the situation they were in? I mean, this is a largely male culture that you're stuck in the middle of, and for the soldiers to see even American women was not going to be a very common kind of thing. I mean, how did the nurses handle that?
Oh, pretty well. I think one of the nurses seemed to be a little friendly and all this kind of stuff. And I struck up a conversation with her, and the next day her husband, who was infantry lieutenant of the 1st Infantry, stopped by and said hi, Doris. And this guy was 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed about 240 pounds. And I thought, gee, I'm glad I didn't hit on her.
Yeah.
You know, so after that I was pretty careful about my behavior.
All right. But I was also kind of asking just from their perspective. I mean, do they have just ways of dealing with the soldiers that kept everybody in their right places, or?
Well, during work they did. Extracurricular activities, maybe a little looser.
All right. Well, was now the 70s, so yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, it was.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, from where you were, did you have any kind of sense of what was going on in the war at that point, or how things were going generally?
Well, Richard Nixon was already pulling people out.
Yeah.
And, you know, I guess most of us didn't realize that his goal was to get everybody out of there as quickly as possible.
Right.
And, you know, the morale in the troops was kind of poor. You know, especially the guys out in the field. And we didn't, you know, you kind of have a sense for that. But unless you're in one of those units, you don't really know what the hell's going on out there. We were busy enough taking care of patients where we didn't pay a lot of attention to other stuff.
Right. Now, did you spend much of any time off the base, either locally or going to Saigon or anything like that?
Saigon was off limits, and I never went there.
Okay.
You know, off the base, there weren't any interesting places to go close. And, you know, Lai Khe was in the middle of Michelin rubber plantation. And the story we heard was that the government paid the Michelin company about $100 for every rubber tree, and then went around and knocked them all down. So that, you know, and the only ones who were left up were the ones in the post for shade for the for some of the buildings. But outside that post, I mean, and then they took the bulldozers and bulldozed everything out. So it was just a flat field outside of there. Yeah, there was, you know.
So you don't have, did you have any Vietnamese who worked on the base?
All the Vietnamese that I knew that worked on the base were the girls that came in, they'd shine your shoes and wash your dishes. And we did a lot of our own cooking and clean up the place. And that's all they did. And they usually came sometime in the morning, left early in the afternoon.
Okay, and did they have to import them in from someplace?
Oh yeah, they didn't stay on the post.
Yeah, I know what I meant. Like, were their villages very close, or did they have to bring them in from some distance?
I think those people were all responsible for their own transportation until they got to the front door.
Okay.
And front gate. And at that post, you know, I never hardly knew where the front gate was. You know, I wasn't too familiar with, you know.
All right. So you basically spent most of your time just on that base?
Most of the time, actually, in our own little area in that base, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
How much contact did you have with home or the outside world at that point?
Letters, that was about it.
Okay.
I also had a tape recorder, and I tape record stuff. But that was pretty much it.
Okay. And then how long did you spend with that MASH unit?
2.5, 3 months.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember exact days anymore.
Right. And then they kind of shut that down and moved you
That
elsewhere?
post stood down, and then I went to Phu Loi post.
Okay. And what was there?
That was, they had an airstrip, and it also was a major maintenance base. They had a unit there called 610 maintenance, and they did maintenance on heavy artillery and big vehicles. I don't know what all they did, actually.
And what was your job there?
I was the one of 2 physicians in dispensary, and our job was like be a medical office and take sick call for all the units on the post that didn't have their own doctors, and most of them didn't.
So about how many people do you think were on the base?
Oh, several thousand.
Okay. That's fairly
A
substantial.
couple thousand. Anyway,
All right.
Yeah.
And the area itself was pretty quiet at that point?
Well, you heard occasional stories. I was there a couple of months. One or two nights, somebody lobbed in a couple of mortars
Mm-hmm.
during the summer, but that was all. And some of the units went outside and got attacked. But this was during the build-up for the Cambodian
Mm-hmm.
incursion, and there just wasn't a lot of enemy activity. We were halfway between Long Bin and Kuchi.
Mm-hmm.
If you went straight across the river, and if you turned right up to Lai Khe, so in that area, there probably was a lot of VC activity, but there weren't any large-scale attacks or anything like that.
Now, at this position, were you not treating civilians anymore, just American military people, or?
Mostly American military people, occasional civilians. We had one guy come in with sores all over his body, looked about 45 or 50 years old. We told the MPs this is a little unusual for somebody around there, and when we tried to leave, they took a handgun off of him, which he wasn't supposed to have, and somebody started asking questions, and I heard later they found out he was a North Vietnamese officer.
Okay.
But that's the only one I remember.
Yeah. And so what kind of business did you have there then? What were you doing?
Well, people would come in with sore throats, and muscular aches and pains.
Mm-hmm.
We had a couple of cases of malaria. We had one guy that stepped on something that exploded anyway. I don't know whether it was some of his stuff or something somebody put there, and lost part of his foot. And it was pretty much like an office-based practice that you'd see at sick call back in the States, actually.
Yeah. Now, would you have preferred to be in a place where you were dealing with like combat casualties, or were you perfectly happy to be where you were at that point?
Oh, I didn't have any complaints about the place.
Mm-hmm.
But I was there a couple of months, and then I heard I was going to the 101st Airborne Division, and I was sort of glad to be doing that.
Right. Okay, now, one of the, I guess, the stereotypes of Vietnam is that when you're on rear area bases and so
Yeah.
forth, there's a lot of drug use and so forth. Did you observe any of that there?
Well, I wasn't part of that culture, and if you weren't part of that culture, it could be going on right in front of you and you wouldn't recognize it, and I'm probably more in that category.
Well, you would notice if your staff were showing up stoned or something like that.
Well, yeah, but these guys had been there long enough to know they couldn't do that.
Okay.
And we had a sergeant at that post who was one of the best I've seen, and he hit those guys pretty straight. He said, I don't care what you guys do at night, but when you come to work, you better be ready to do your job.
Mm-hmm.
And by and large, they were. And it wasn't my job to police that activity either.
Right. But as far as you could tell, certainly your own unit, but the units that you're observing are functioning and they're doing their jobs properly.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We were next door to an aviation company, and that's where we ate the officers ate their meals, and the men
Mhm.
ate their meals, because we had about a 15-man detachment there, and they don't supply cooks and kitchens.
Yeah.
Those guys, when you're dealing with aircraft and stuff, you
Mhm.
get somebody that screws up, you'll have a plane crash.
Right.
These guys didn't have very many planes that crashed.
Mm-hmm.
The only ones I knew about are the ones that got shot down.
All right. So you're spending time hanging out with the pilots and
For lunch and dinner.
yeah.
And they had an officers club. Sometimes we'd go over there at night and play cards.
Now, were they kind of a wilder bunch than the doctors?
Oh, well, they were different anyway.
Mhm.
They probably were a little wilder,
All right.
a little more into risk taking.
Mm-hmm.
Or they wouldn't have been doing that job. They lost a couple pilots when I was there, and they probably were. Yeah.
All right. So when then do you move up to the 101st?
Sometime right after the middle of May,
Okay.
and got up there, and I think there were two of us that were assigned to the 101st Airborne. I think the other guy's name was Dean Ashiki, and I thought as I'd go to 101st Airborne, I'd want to get in the best unit I could.
Mm-hmm.
And they had me assigned to the 3rd of the 187th, and I asked the guy, are they up in the mountains? And he said no. He said the other unit that's up there is a little better unit. So I said, well, I'll take that one.
Okay.
So that's how I got in the 2nd of the 506th.
All right. And then where did you join them?
A couple of days at Camp Evans,
Okay.
and Colonel Lucas was interested in me going to the Firebase,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't have any objections to that. Turns out most of the other guys did, and the other doctors. But so I think I'd been there a couple of days, and I went out to Firebase Ripcord.
All right. And at the time you get the invitation, if you will. What did you know about Ripcord or what was going on out there?
Absolutely nothing.
Okay. All right.
All I heard was there was some enemy activity around.
Yeah. What was the normal thing? If you come in to join a battalion as their surgeon, that's
Yeah.
your title, would you normally stay at the rear area base camp and stuff would come to you? Or
Well, if you stay at the rear area base camp, not much has come to you, but the same kind of sick call we had at Lai Khe, at Phu Loi.
okay, so you wouldn't be working, say, at the aid station there or something like that, because
Well, there was an aid station on the base camp,
right.
and there was another aid station at the fire base.
Okay, but basically in principle, the surgeon would go where the battalion commander and the HQ are, or
Well, quite honestly, I think most of the guys broke out in hives when they got told to go to the fire bases.
all right,
And I know a lot of them didn't go, and none of them wanted to.
Right.
I was one of the only people that I knew that didn't object strongly.
okay. Well, if they're not going to the fire bases, what are they doing?
Hanging around the battalion aid station in the rear areas.
Well, I guess okay. So basically, you get the sort of. You're not even ordered exactly to go. Colonel Lucas just encourages you to do this, or
Well, no, it was direct order, but
Okay. But you weren't resistant to it.
No.
Okay. All right. Okay.
It was a little bit of a misunderstanding. I thought I needed 24 hours more in the base camp, and he thought I was just, going to do it was going to be 24 hours every day.
Mm-hmm.
So he made a strongly worded statement that said, go tomorrow, and I said, yes, sir, done it.
Okay. Now, flying out to Ripcord, what does it look like to you as you approach it?
Well, it doesn't look much different than the picture. Here's the top of a hill that looks like a sand pile, and guns everywhere, and barbed wire everywhere there wasn't a gun, and a landing pad.
Mm-hmm. And then the terrain around it?
Well, it was on top of a big hill, and it was mountainous terrain, and the mountains weren't high, but boy, they were awful steep. And it was rugged country.
Okay. When you
No
came,
roads, by the way, at all.
yeah.
The nearest American road was 10 miles away. That was the one that went to Firebase Ripcord.
Mm-hmm.
And the nearest North Vietnamese road was 4 miles away, and that's why we were there. We were shooting at it.
Right. All right. Now, what was the setup for the aid station on Ripcord when you got there?
Well, by the time I got there, the landing pad was, I don't know, maybe 40 to 50 meters long. And it was in the side of the hill, and just next to the landing pad, somebody cut a big ditch along the side of the hill. And the floor in the ditch was about even with the landing pad, and that's where the bunkers were. And they covered the roof of that ditch up with the aircraft.
The PSP,
steel,
yeah.
the PSP, and sandbags over it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a few entrances. There was one for Commo, one for us, one for the 2501 TOC, and one for the 2506 TOC. And then there's an opening at the end.
All right. And then, I think physically, how large was the actual aid station part?
Well, they were almost divided into three. And we had a small room, which was big enough to hold a stretcher on the two stands we had, and work around it a little bit. And that was off to the side. There was the room right away when you went in was a little bigger than that. And then there was one off to the left when you came in that kind of went down to the commo area. And we had a connex there, and we had supplies in there, and a couple of guys slept in there.
Mm-hmm. And so what sort of staff now do you have at the aid station?
I had 91 Charlie, which is a 1-year training medic, several field medics, and myself.
All right. And so basically you kind of sleep in your work area, or?
I slept in a connex next to the top.
Okay. All right. So you get there in that sort of end of May or middle of May?
Yeah, Probably just before the beginning of the last week in May.
Okay. All right. And then did you now start to get a sense of what was going on in and around Ripcord?
Well, at that time, you know, we heard about enemy contacts and stuff, but we never took any incoming then.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until July, I
Yeah.
think, that we really took very much incoming, any at all, really.
Yeah.
And it was hard. You know, I didn't know what was going on out in the
Mm-hmm.
field. My men have always told me, Doc, you know, you may have been the fire base, but the fire base is not the field.
Mm-hmm.
The couple guys are pretty emphatic about that. But yeah, they were right, of course.
Now, in those first, that first month or so when you're out there before the siege proper really starts, would you kind of go out and climb around on the hill and look around?
Yeah. And we were there 2 weeks. We had a week for it to stand down, and then we went back again.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about a couple of weeks after we got there, after the stand down, that we really started stepping in trouble.
Right. Okay. So before July, in that first month or so, what kind of were you getting casualties brought up onto the base, or did you only deal?
Well, all the casualties on the field were medevac to areas. You know, all the casualties that I took care of, with very few exceptions, were people that were injured on the fire base.
Mm-hmm.
And an occasional low back pain, and stuff like
hauling
that.
too many artillery shells at once, or whatever else it might have been.
Yeah, they had lots of those. The 155s weighed 97 pounds apiece, and the 105s in that canister probably weighed about 50.
All right. How well were you getting to know the people who were up on the base, especially the headquarters staff and the ones who were there more permanently?
Well, we were all busy doing our jobs, but we all had battalion briefings, and most of the meals I ate with the men, the sea rations, and stuff. But you interacting with these guys all the time, and I think I knew some of them pretty well. I think the ones I probably knew the best was Dave Rich and Colonel Lucas, and I know Herb Koenigsbauer. I think those are the ones that I probably knew the best.
Okay, so Rich was one of the battery commanders.
He was the battery commander for Alpha, 2nd of the 319th.
Okay, so that's the 105 battery.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, and Koenigsbauer is sort of the XO or whatever.
He was the operations officer.
Yeah, and then and Lucas, the battalion commander in charge of the post. Yeah. Now, before the siege part starts, I mean, did you have very many casualties to deal with?
No.
Okay.
Almost none, really.
Yeah.
I can't think of one casualty or medical action until that started. They may have been there, but I just don't remember.
Right. Okay. So that first month or so, are you wondering, well, why exactly it was that he wanted you on the base to begin with?
Well, I didn't really care. Actually, it was nice, and it was perfect weather up there. It was 3,000 feet. It hardly ever got much hotter than about 80 degrees. You go down 1,000 feet, it was a lot hotter. Yeah. But you could build a resort in that spot at that time, and it'd be a nice, pleasant spot.
All right. Okay. So initially, it really doesn't seem all like such a bad place to be.
Oh, the terrain and the altitude and all that kind of it, hell, it was almost perfect.
All right. Now, about 1st of July, you start to come under bombardment.
Yeah, and I don't remember if it was the first or second, but the first one was about 7 o'clock in the morning. They dropped in a couple rounds.
Yeah.
And it was several days, I think, before we had anybody really hurt on the hill. But the 2nd of July, they went into Charlie Company, and Charlie Company made some mistakes and paid dearly for it. There were a few guys from Charlie Company that made it over the fire base that we medevac. Most of the perforated eardrums that I had to send back.
Yeah. What can you do for a perforated eardrum anyway?
Wait 3 weeks for it to heal.
Okay.
That's your only choice. I mean, there's no medicine for it. There's nothing you can do to make it heal any faster.
All right. Now, I guess the night of the 2nd, when Charlie Company got hit, that Hill 902 is not very far from Ripcord. Could you hear or see anything that night, or?
Well, that was dawn when they did that, and I was in a Connex off by myself, and I really didn't know much until they were almost over with. But some of my men had been in Charlie Company before they got pulled out, and boy, these guys, even the men on the firebase were hurting because they knew their guys were getting done out there, and it was just a plain old bad deal.
Yeah. Because I think one of the platoons from the company was actually up on Ripcord at the time,
Yeah,
so you had them,
Yeah,
and that's their guys who were down there.
yeah. But some of my, you know, the people I talked to first were my own medics.
Right.
And I didn't know where the lead, where the guys from Charlie Company were staying, actually. I didn't know anything about that, but, you know, some of my men really felt bad about it.
Because the medics sort of rotated out of the field at some point, right?
Well, I think if they'd been in the field for 6 months, we'd try and pull them out. If we
Yeah.
had the manpower to do it, we would, and if we didn't, we couldn't,
Okay.
you know, and they kind of understood that.
All right. And then after 902, I mean, things escalate, more bombardment comes in,
Yeah.
more shooting going out.
Yeah.
And then, so those last sort of those last 3 weeks there on Ripcord, can you kind of tell us sort of what you remember about that?
Well, I think during the 3 weeks we were there, you know, especially towards the end of the 3 weeks, you had less and less inclined to go outside for a stroll, you know, and especially after that Chinook went down, blew up my aid station, which was right next to a big pile of shells from the 105 battery, and when that went up, my aid station was replaced by a big hole in the ground.
All right.
I can show you a picture of that hole in the book.
Now where were you when the Chinook crash happens? And where were you? What were you doing?
I was in the aid bunker at the time, and well, actually, I was outside, and I could hear the impact from the bullets hitting on the side of that Chinook.
Mm-hmm.
It sounded like somebody throwing rocks at a tin building, and or a tin roof. And that thing went down, and I knew we were in for a tough time, and I just thought it's time to get your ass under cover. So I went inside the bunker,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't know anything about the situation of that fellow that was pinned
Mm-hmm.
under there.
Right.
I don't think there's anything I could have done for him.
Because they couldn't get him out. So.
No. But, and he was the only death I think we had that day. But, you know, the bunker, which, you know, in order to keep the guys away from the dirt, they put the wooden boards from the ammo boxes up and used them for walls.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that started burning down by the commo end there, and we pretty well figured that our place was going to burn too. And one of the medics, named Danny Goodrich, produced an axe that I found out about a month ago he'd stolen from the inside of a helicopter that
Mm-hmm.
got shot down. Chopped a hole in one of the wooden boxes that was kind of a partition between us and the 2501 talk, and we all went through that hole in the wall and got down to the other end of the bunker line where our own talk was,
Mm-hmm.
and somewhere in between there was a spot that nobody had lined with anything, so we knew that was a fire break, but all the rest of it burned. And we all kind of, in the heat of battle, at least at that time, had kind of forgotten about all those ammunition rounds. So it really was lucky we moved.
Right. Okay. And so I guess before the Chinook crash goes, I mean,
Yeah.
you are getting casualties though up on top of the fire
Oh,
base
yeah.
by then.
Oh,
So
yeah.
now you're. Do you have a sense of sort of how many you got? Would be 1 or 2 a day, or okay, only
Well,
some
they
days?
came in bunches.
Okay.
And we had about 3 days that were particularly bad, and every once in a while they'd drop in one and you might get somebody hurt or killed. But, you know, we had at least 3 or 4 days where we had a lot of casualties. And, you know, the log for the casualties went up in smoke when the bunker blew up.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have the logbook, but my sense at that time was that we had about 20 guys got killed on top of that hill,
Mm-hmm.
and about 100 guys got wounded, and we had a daily census in the hill of about 300.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then you get into that after the Chinook crash, then you just had those sort of like the last 5 days or whatever.
Yeah, 3 or 4, yeah.
Yeah, and the bombardment gets heavier and.
More accurate too, I think. When they first started getting after us, especially Rich would get up there, and if he knew where that was coming from, he'd get his people up in the middle of a bombardment and they'd be shooting back. And usually, if they knew where it was coming from, they would win those battles.
Mm-hmm.
They had a lot more firepower.
Yeah. But then once the 105 battery is essentially destroyed,
We lost our rapid response
Right.
ability, and that just did us in.
Yeah.
You know, you could, if you looked at those 105s, the back end of those is like a tire on it, and you can traverse those guns 360 degrees in just a few seconds. The 155s, you couldn't even begin to do that.
I mean, there were a couple of the gunners talk about one gun maybe being in the right position where you could actually use direct fire against a target, but that was just
Yeah.
a sheer accident that
Oh yeah,
it was set up
just
that
luck.
way.
It was just luck.
Yeah, and otherwise they'd have to try to aim practically straight up and have something almost like a mortar and have it land somewhere, but the gun was so big.
Well, it was hard to do that with
Yeah.
155s, and a 105, you can fire 6 rounds off of those in about 10 seconds, maybe a few seconds more. The 155s, you just couldn't do that. You had to put in the projectile and then a powder charge, and it was just too slow.
All right, and then, because Rich gets hit, and then I think about the 21st or so, Bob Kalsu,
I don't remember what day Bob Kelso got killed.
Yeah,
I
it
don't
was-
even remember if it was before or after.
It was a little after
I
the
sensed myself, yeah, I thought it was after, yeah.
yeah, and so he was killed, and the sergeant was killed, I think, at the
Yeah.
same time.
Yeah.
And so I guess those, and then with the bombardments just getting heavier, and sort of basically, are you
Yeah.
spending your time now kind of, where are you working now that the aid station isn't there anymore?
Well, my men cobbled together a bunch of supplies, and they had the aid stations in the Army in those days basically centered around metal canisters that looked like just a big metal box, and the supplies are supposed to be in there. And of course, in the fixed positions we had, those things got put off to the side. But they just filled a couple of those up with stuff, and we had enough supplies to take care of people the minute they could fly them in after the aid station went up. We just got on the horn and said, put some stuff together. We don't have anything left out here. And the guys in the rear did a good job.
And so where did you set up then?
Mostly in the talk.
Okay.
If I can remember, you know. And that's where we didn't have anything like laid out on shelves or anything.
Right.
But that's where the canisters were. And the right next to the talk kind of was the sleeping quarters for some of the officers, which is where I slept after that. And you know, it worked out.
All right. And basically, up there at the aid station, I mean, you're essentially giving them basic treatment and then flying them out? Or?
Oh, that's all we ever did. Yeah.
Okay. And then you get down to like, at what point do you find out that you're leaving?
The day before.
Okay.
You know, I think most of us kind of had a sense, you know, if things get much worse around here, we could be in a pile of trouble. You know, and you know, I mean, things were not moving in the right direction for us. And somewhere right near the end of that, I think we found out that the 101st Airborne had ammunition restrictions on how much we could fire off, and found out one night we burned up the entire division restriction for about 4 days, you know, and stuff. But you know, I think the real message was that you guys, you know, if you don't win out there, we're not going to be able to send you any help either. And you know, it was a good decision they would have taken a brigade to reinforce us.
Yeah, well, and that was essentially Harrison's plan for if you were going to win this, here's how you do it.
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know if you call it a plan, I'd call it more of a suggestion. But I think he was right. You know, I mean, you know, he said, this is what we got to do to win, and some people go, you know, look, you know, we just can't do that. So they pulled us out.
All right. Okay. And then just kind of try to take me through what do you see or remember about that last day when you're evacuating?
Well, you know, about the last 2 or 3 days, Alpha Company got hit the day before awfully hard, and Delta 1506 got hit awfully hard. And you know, we spent a lot of time thinking about that, and it really wasn't until late in the day before that we started preparing to leave.
Yeah.
And you know, I think the plan was at first light we're going to lift out the 155s and anything we could string under a Chinook, and then we get the men off in slicks later. And that's pretty much what happened. I think Colonel Lucas was up flying around and landed on the post, and he was talking to Major Tanner, and he picked a bad spot to do it because I think NVA had an observer looking at that spot, and he got hit with an 82 millimeter mortar, and it killed Tanner instantly.
Mm-hmm.
And we got Colonel Lucas inside, but he died later, which was kind of a rough day for.
Yeah.
It was a rough day for some, and Lucas was, I think, pretty much completely misunderstood by a lot of people. But I think he did a lot better out there than a lot of people gave him credit for. But he died, and
yeah. How did you read Lucas? In what sense did you have of him?
Well, I got stories to tell about Colonel Lucas. I got at least three.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one was we were all outside the entrance of the tower, and
That's probably the main.
our guys were firing in. It looked like they were firing in a target on a landing zone with 81 millimeter mortars,
Mm-hmm.
and it was really just a diversion. And we had a beacon drop arranged, and Sergeant Armstrong, who was the intelligence sergeant and who saved our butts on several occasions, because the stuff he figured out he had guessed that the K-35 sappers were in a certain location, and he was right. And we dropped the last mortar, and about less than a minute later, there's all these bombs from an A4. I think the beacon drop, I think they said they could put 22 or 28 500-pound bombs in an area half the size of a football field. And when they did that, it started a petroleum fire.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, geez, those guys are planning to stay a long time if they've got generators there.
Yeah.
And Lucas turned around and says, well, Doc, it looks like we got their flamethrowers. And I was thinking, holy shit, those guys really are in a bad mood. You know, and that was one. And the second one was one of the nights that Hill 805 was being attacked, and the wind was blowing 60 miles an hour and was blowing all the 81 illumination rounds. That's my wife. Off of the target. Excuse me. Hello? Can I talk to you later? What? Okay. Bye. Anyway, Lucas found out about that quick enough, and found out what happened, and the lieutenant or whoever was in charge of fire clearance denied the 105's clearance to fire, and he knew he had to get that. And he probably knew that guy's boss, but he called him up on the phone, and I thought to myself, I'm going to hear some new words tonight. And Lucas did nothing of the sort. In the most concise possible way, he explained to the guy what was going on, what he needed, without giving the guy any reason or opportunity to argue with him, and got exactly what he needed. And I don't think he could have done it any better. And Rich, of course, the minute the guy, he knew Lucas was talking to the guy, the phone started firing because he knew he'd get clearance. But that was a real performance. He was under fire then, and if he'd have done anything that would start arguing with that guy, we'd have got more guys killed than we did. And he knew that, and he had the communication skills that it took to deal with that. And the third story is when he had that argument with Jeff Wilcox. And, I think Wilcox started arguing the merits of the war, which there weren't any, and Wilcox was right. But Lucas said it's not our job to make those decisions. And, and I think Lucas was right too. And I think if you look at the Constitution, it says the president is the commander-in-chief. And if you have a military that isn't going to obey orders, you don't have much. And I think if you have a military that doesn't obey the orders of the commander-in-chief, like go to Vietnam, you're probably not going to be able to preserve your democracy very long. And the military not obeying orders is a threat to the democracy in this country. And Lucas and a lot of other senior officers were going to have that happen on their watch, and I think Lucas gave up his life for that. There aren't very many people that feel that way, and you can articulate that. But I know in my heart that's what happened.
All right. You get now. You mentioned before the interview, you got a couple of miscellaneous stray injuries while you were up there.
Yeah.
Or, what happened to you?
Well, the first time was at the fire range.
Okay.
The one that I got on Ripcord was the day before we evacuated.
Mm-hmm.
And may have, I didn't tell anybody I was injured at the time, but I think there were other injuries at the same time. And the situation, I think, reinforced the decision to evacuate. We had some casualties, most likely from a mortar round. And I don't, none of them was real serious, but we had enough for 2 loads. And we got the first load loaded up, and about 20 meters down the hill, it was an 82 millimeter mortar went off just after the helicopter took off. And I knew that if those guys turned the crank on that aiming device on the 82 millimeter mortar, that the next one would be right in the back pockets. And a little apprehensive about that, but we loaded up the second one, and they took off, and that's exactly what happened. That thing landed right where that helicopter had been. And I was running as fast as I could. I was just far enough away, so all I took was a small frag in the back of my leg. I didn't bother to look at my flak jacket, And it wasn't a consequential wound at all. I never told anybody about it until later.
So you just taped yourself up, or?
Yeah, it hardly needed a Band-Aid, but it was, I heard later various stories where there were casualties on the helicopter as a result of that round or not. But one of the things that General Berry mentioned to us when he talked to us after we got back was that he knew we were going to have trouble medevacing our casualties. And I'm glad we didn't have any more. I'm glad we didn't have 3 loads that day.
Yeah. And from your perspective, sort of, how well did the evacuation go?
Well, there's always a lot of confusion and stuff, and I think they were pounding the helicopter pad right in front of the TOC, which was about the only hiding place we had, and there was a big foxhole on the other side. And you'd wait till one of those mortars went off, and they'd have 10 seconds to drop another one down the tube. They had to wait that long. So 2 guys would run across and jump in that foxhole. The helicopter would land at sometime after, as quickly as possible after another one of those rounds went off. And 2 guys would jump in the helicopter from that side and 3 from the TOC, and they'd take off. And they got everybody. I don't know if we took any casualties from that or not. We did have casualties that day besides Ruckus.
Yeah.
And he, but I remember jumping on a helicopter, and I was on one side, somebody was on the other end, and the guy in the middle didn't quite make it on. We both grabbed his arm and pulled him on. I think we just about threw him out the other side. A little adrenaline there.
How long did you stay on there?
Oh, I think I was one of the middle guys that left. I wasn't the first one off.
All right.
And it wasn't the last by any means.
Now, when you got back, did you go to Evans?
Well, we did, and actually the helicopter was on, took a frag, and we were leaking hydraulic fluid all the way back, and smoke, and they landed right inside the wire, and it took me a while to get back to the 2506 area, which is where our group was supposed to assemble.
Right. Did you go to work as a doctor at that point, or did you just stay with the battalion, or?
Well, all the casualties were being sent other places.
Okay.
They were either, a lot of them came into Charlie Med, and some of the casualties from Alpha Company were coming in then. Well, they'd probably pretty much done with those guys by that time. But, and I know Colonel Lucas went into Charlie Med, and I think I heard later he died after he was there, and I talked to a medic that took care of him and said he was dead when he got there. So.
Yeah. All right. Now, you're out of there, and you're back at Camp Evans, back at the battalion. Now what do you do?
Well, we sat around for a day or 2 and then just went back to work. I think, it's kind of a bummer having to leave. And, I don't like getting kicked off or pushed around. But, looking back on it, probably didn't need to be there in the first place either. But, we were pretty down, I think we take a lot of casualties and basically lost the fight.
Yeah. And
a little bit of a downer.
Yeah. Now, how much time did you have left then in Vietnam at that point?
Well, this was the 23rd of July, and let's see, August, September, October, 4 more months.
Okay. And how did you spend those last 4 months?
Well, we stood down for about a week. We went to Firebase, I think it was Firebase Catherine.
Mm-hmm.
After that, spent a month there. Came back for a week, spent some time at Rakkasan, and then I went on R&R for a week. And came back, and this was middle of October when I got back, and I think we were out at Rakkasan for a while after that too. And
Where'd you go in R&R?
Hong Kong.
All right. And did you pick that, or was that just what was available at the time?
Oh, I pretty much wanted to go there, yeah.
And I don't know, what was it like to be sort of out of Vietnam at that point?
Well, this is a different world too,
Yeah.
so I just, and I had I bought a camera and I bought some lenses for it there, and I had a couple of shopping things to do, and I just kind of went around and looked at the place. Went on the bus tour to the top of the hill in Kowloon, and I took a lot of nice pictures.
And how easy or hard was it to get on the plane to go back to Vietnam?
Well, it wasn't that tough.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't, we were, life was not a big bowl of cherries when you're on a fire base, but, it wasn't that tough.
Yeah. Well, were things relatively quiet after Ripcord?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we had very few casualties after that. It's not like we didn't have any, but we didn't have a lot.
Yeah. Were you also were you with the guys in a more a jungle kind of setting? Did you have tropical stuff to treat, or jungle rot, or that kind of thing?
Well, yes and no, but, the best way to get rid of all that stuff is get the guy in the shower with soap and water. Actually cured most of it, And if you couldn't do that, there wasn't much else that worked either. The few that the soap and water didn't work on, we had stuff that we put on them, and it mostly worked. But, we had some guys that, I think there were a lot of minor puncture wounds from spines on the plants and stuff, and we had a lot of guys with infections in their hands from grabbing vines and stuff, and those usually a shot of penicillin, sometimes several days in a row, and some pills, but, the real bad stuff, we didn't expect us to be able to take care of that.
How would you characterize morale in the unit in those last few months?
Well, it's a good thing we didn't have any hard fighting. We had a lot of new guys in after that. We had, our unit, we looked through one day and
About what sort of morale was like in those last few months?
yeah, well, and we had a lot of new guys, and we looked through our records and cobbled things together, and our battalion, and I don't know what full strength was, it was probably not much more than 1,000, maybe even less, but we had 40 dead and 200 wounded in 3 weeks, and that doesn't count all the stuff that they got when they had to get on the fire base in the first place. So in 6 months, our unit had a lot of casualties, and almost everybody we had was new. All the company commanders were new, at least new at company commander, a couple of guys. Kenny Lamb was our personnel officer, another Green Beret who could take people anywhere, and did, even then. And the other guys were all the company commanders were new people that hadn't been in our unit, and a lot of the men were. And, and it was just a different war after that. And we were just not, everybody kind of knew that we were not going to get into that situation again.
Now, in those last months, did you ever observe anybody, say, with drugs in the field or things like that? Or
not in the field so much.
Okay.
I think our guys talked about that a lot, and we had guys that smoked pot, and we had some problems with drugs. But the guys on the field knew that if they used drugs, their chances of getting killed would go way up. And most of them were pretty good about that. And some of the ones that did get killed. And they started an amnesty program sometime that fall. If you used to have 2 choices, either go to the field or go to jail. Now you got 3. Go to the field, go to jail, or go to drug amnesty. And I think our guys weren't interested in locking people up in jail, and they weren't interested in sending people out to the field that weren't going to be able to help their buddies.
Right.
So the drug amnesty program was a good out for some. It helped everybody.
Now, one of the things that went on in 1970, at least across much of Vietnam, was that heroin started to show up more commonly.
Showed up in our place somewhere within a week or two of the 1st of September. 95% pure heroin. There were deaths all over Vietnam. I don't think we had any in our unit from that stuff. But these guys would snort that stuff, and they weren't used to anything like that before. And at that time, nobody believed that cocaine was addicting. This stuff was strong enough.
Yeah.
These guys thought they were snorting coke, and it was heroin. And we had a couple guys go into the amnesty program, and they couldn't even stand up. They were so stoned on that stuff. You know, and we're just glad not to have them around anymore. But it was, yeah, it was a problem.
Yeah, it apparently cut off the regular smuggling routes through Cambodia. When we went into Cambodia, everything wound up getting dumped in Vietnam, or at least that's the explanation I've seen.
Yeah, I'd be skeptical of any explanation. You could tell me 3 different ways that happened, and I'd probably be skeptical of all of them. But even the medics were coming. These guys, they just don't know what they're using. And the word was you could buy the stuff right outside the front gate to Camp Evans. And it was, you can do the best you can't prevent it.
Right.
And I think the stuff we had, you can show up for work and do your job well, and don't look like you're half asleep all the time. Kind of ignored them. It's a bit of an operational definition or something like that. But it worked.
Yeah.
The military in general, right about that time, I started dealing with addiction problems a lot more, with a little more intelligence, and a little smarter than they had before too. Alcohol when guys got back.
All right. Now, as you got down to the end of the tour, were you counting down your days to get out of there?
Oh, not until the last few.
Okay.
I remember hearing somebody one time, 66 days.
Yeah.
And Charlie Lee shouting out the window, if I had 66 days left, I'd slash my wrists. So the minute I heard that, I said, whatever you do, don't count the days.
All right. Now, so when do you leave?
Right around Thanksgiving time in November. I remember getting home. I went straight home from there. I jumped on the plane in Cam Bay, all the way to Seattle, and I flew to Minneapolis, drove home in the morning. Knocked on the door, welcome home.
When you went through Seattle, did anybody warn you about protesters or anything like that?
I didn't have to leave the airport.
But even at the airport, I mean, that's the...
Well, I just went down the hall.
Okay.
So I didn't have to deal with any of that stuff.
Good.
I was glad. I would not have been in a good mood to deal with that.
All right. Now, when you get home, now you still have time left in the service at this point, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So you're home on leave essentially for the holidays?
Yeah. Showed up at Fort Lee, Virginia about the 3rd or 4th of January. I was supposed to be there the 1st or the 2nd or something like that. I called up and asked the guy if I could stay a couple extra days home. Why not?
Yeah.
So I got
All right. You get to Fort Lee, and then what?
Well, in the bachelor officer quarters. Well, I got, we got a little brochure in Vietnam from Fort Lee. That says there, we always have space available in the BOQ. And I showed up there on a Sunday, and the guy, we don't have any space. And I said, bullshit. The commander says there's always space in the BOQ. And I told him, I'm not spending a night in a hotel. You guys are going to have to find someplace. I wasn't going to take any crap from some clerk,
Yeah.
after I'd been in the field. Well, I had the Firebase anyway. And, especially, I said, your boss wrote me and said there was space in this BOQ. Post commander did.
Yeah.
And so they handed me a key and say, well, you can stay here tonight, but come back tomorrow and we'll give you a room. It turned out it was the VIP BOQ.
Oh, okay.
So I spent a night there, which was kind of a crappy old building with a creaky wooden floor. And the next day I showed up and they gave me 3 keys and said, take your pick of which one you wanted. And I picked the one that was the closest to the hospital, which was a lot newer building and actually a lot nicer.
Now, did you spend the rest of your tour there, or?
Well, I was based at Fort Lee, but I spent about 3 or 4 or 5 months at Camp Pickett, Virginia. They had one doctor at Camp Pickett, and And his job during the winter was to take care of some of the civilians, and they had a couple of thousand civilian records, a lot of retirees and dependents in that area. And but during the summer, it was National Guard and Army Reserve training area. And so they had, I think the most people they had on the post then, and we had 80 during the winter, 6,000 in the summer. And so I had a little busier. And a lot of those guys brought their own medics and stuff, but not all of them. And
now, did you get those sort of injuries from field exercises, just guys getting sick? Or?
well, we had a few. We had a softball game one night, and some guy broke his leg sliding into first base, and the next night somebody broke his leg sliding into second base, and the next night somebody broke his leg sliding into third base. We never did get anybody broke his leg sliding into home plate.
Home doesn't stick above the ground, not in the head.
Yeah.
But I think you would have been wondering at that point.
And I think one of the local troopers was competing in the local rodeo and got gored by a bull. And we had a medevac company then, and they gave him a ride up to Fort Lee. And they operated on him up there. But we didn't get a lot of casualties, you know. You just didn't.
All right. Now, once you're back from Vietnam, are you paying attention to sort of the news reporting on it, or on the anti-war movement, or any of that stuff?
Well, the anti-war movement we just pretty much dismissed. Fortunately, it was anywhere we were. I remember the movie Patton came out, I think, sometime during that year for the first time. And there was about 5 or 6 of us that went. Every one of us was a captain. We all had been in combat units. And there's a line in that movie that where the opening speech where he says it isn't the poor bastard that dies for his country that's a real hero. The real hero is the one that makes the other poor bastard die for his country. And I think about 6 of us all stood up and gave Patton a standing ovation. The crowd had a few strange looks with that, but nobody gave us any grief. So, you know, we didn't hold the anti-war movement in much respect.
All right. Now, did you just have 1 year left, or?
I got back from Vietnam and in November started at Fort Lee the 1st of January. My date to leave for home was about the 8th of I forget what day in October, but anyway, they had 3 days travel time.
All right.
And that was the day I left in October, and I started my surgery training program the 1st of January.
Okay, and then where were you doing that?
Hennepin County General Hospital.
Okay, so you go back to where you would have been had you not had the detour to the Army.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
I knew I was taking that detour.
Okay. Now, did the Army make any effort to get you to stay?
No. And, you know, I mean, I was at Fort Lee, Virginia. I mean, that's the quartermaster corps. They, you know, one of my buddies was the 3rd officer in charge of physical training for the cook battalion. You know, they were going to be Army cooks. Twice a month, he took them out and they did push-ups somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, it was a completely different atmosphere than a combat unit. And if I'd have gone back to one of the combat units, it probably would have put some pressure on me. But these guys were pretty low key. And almost all the officers we had were short-termers like me. Some of these guys got back and they had 2 months left in the Army, and I think the only thing I remember pressure one day I had to notice that the hospital commander wanted to talk to me. What's this all about? You know? So I walk into his office and he tried to get me to buy more savings bonds.
Oh.
I found out later they did that to everybody.
Okay. All right. So now you're out. Basically, you're just going to pick up your life where you left it off and
Pretty
go
much,
forward.
yeah. You know, I was not married still, and I knew I was going to do that program of surgery was 5 years. So I just started it
And then
through there.
once you completed that, now do you go and do a practice somewhere? Or
Yeah,
what do you-
yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Passed my boards and you know, you have to practice a little while before you let you take the boards. It just timing was all.
Right.
But I did that.
And then are you still practicing doctor at this point?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. And where in Minnesota is Worthington?
Southwest corner. We're on I-90 and about 10 miles north of Iowa and about,
So the really flat part of Minnesota, right?
a few hills, but
Okay.
basically flat, yeah.
Seems to me I've driven on I-90 and it struck me outwardly Minnesota is an awfully flat place.
Yeah, we're a little bit west of there, and the terrain is a little more.
If you get closer to the river and
It's well, our particular area is a ridge line there,
yeah.
and called Buffalo Ridge, and the Des Moines River is east of there, so there's a few hills.
Okay. Now, to look back at your time in the service, and especially in Vietnam, how do you think that affected you?
Oh, well, I think it really conditions your attitude about stuff, and you think about this. Like, you don't get asked very many questions like that, but you think about it a lot, and I think you have a different attitude about what's important and what's not, and probably different than people that haven't been there. It really does condition your attitude, and I think you also probably have a different attitude about what's risk and what's not. In medicine, you're taking a risk. Your patient might die. Well, hell, I'm going to see the sunrise in the morning. He's the one that's at risk.
Yeah.
And you tend to think about that a little more. I've talked to other people who maybe don't see it that way, but that's the way I look at it anyway.
All right. Well, it makes for a good story. And while we can't know exactly what it was like to be in your shoes, you've at least covered a certain chunk of that gap. So thank you very much for talking to me
Yeah,
today.
you're welcome. Yeah, I'm glad to do this.
All right.